Nothing lasts forever. It's a cliche, yes, but one that holds a lot of truth, especially when it comes to nations and empires. The environment and circumstances that give rise to one kingdom will change eventually, and when that happens, empires, countries, individuals are all left with one choice: adapt or die. The Romans, the Germanic tribes, and the Persians all faced that choice as the world changed in the 3rd century. Across the world, the climate was changing, and to the east, new peoples were stirring: Slavic tribes and horse nomads from Central Asia. As a result, many Germanic tribes abandoned their ancestral homelands in search of greener pastures to the west. As they did, their cultures and religions evolved. It was a similar story in Persia, where a new dynasty arose to overthrow the Parthians. For too long, Persia had been under the rule of Hellenized Shahs. It was time to restore the pride and glory of the Persian Empire of old. Once, half the human population lived and died by the word of the King of Kings. The new Sassanid dynasty sought to destroy the Greek influence in Persia left behind by the conquests of Alexander, and restore the glory days of the Achaemenid Empire. And then there was the focus for this episode: Rome itself. With the assassination of Severus Alexander by his own troops, all of Rome's institutions dating back to the time of Augustus, and even before, had failed. The Senate had become a vestigial body compared to the emperor. Romanization in the provinces had been very effective, but the peoples of the provinces had no connection to the Senate or even to the city of Rome. No, for them, the emperor was Rome. The old gray men of the Senate were a holdover from an age that had come and gone. Meanwhile, the Roman army and Praetorian Guard had grown corrupt and gone soft. The Praetorians routinely slaughtered the emperors they were sworn to protect, and the army struggled against even small Germanic incursions. The world-conquering legions of the past were gone. The old Roman way of war would simply not work anymore. Both the Emperor's Guard and the legions would need to undergo a drastic transformation if the empire was to survive. And finally, there was the emperor himself. Since Augustus, the man holding the title of imperator was a king in everything but name. Rome's ancient republican tradition made it politically impossible to declare oneself the king in the Eternal City. But that was changing. The republican tradition had been in decline for centuries. As I mentioned, the Senate wasn't exactly what it used to be. As the crisis reached its end, a new type of emperor would rise to rule a new empire. The Balkan soldier emperors that rose at the end of the 3rd century were self-made men that came from nothing. They were brutes, uncultured, rough, taciturn, but they were what Rome needed. And all of them would take the role of emperor further from its republican shyness and make it into an early form of the divinely appointed emperors of medieval Byzantium. Throughout all the chaos, new religions and ways of life emerged and became powers in the new order. A religion started by a poor carpenter from Nazareth would sweep through every level of the Roman population. A cult of divine masculinity would find its own patrons. Mystery cults of the ancient Hellenic gods would thrive, while an Egyptian goddess became popular throughout the empire. As prayers to Jupiter and Venus went unanswered, new gods would fill the void. But the Roman religion of days gone by would not go down without a fight. The 3rd century was an age of chaos and upheaval. But this is not a story of destruction. This is a story of transformation. This is the story of a changing world, of leaders across the world of late antiquity, and how they saw their people through the long, dark night and into the dawn of a new era. We human beings are a funny bunch. Mixed up bundles of contradictions in spirit, as much angels as we are devils. And history is our story. It's the million little epic tales, of which yours is a part. The actions of our ancestors echo in us. The good, the bad, and the in-between. The past may be a different country, and they may do things differently there. But it's a country we've all visited, through the same human drama that has been played out millions of times over thousands of years. And if we know where we've been, then maybe we'll be able to see where we're going. This is Renegade Historian, and these are our stories. Immediately in the wake of Severus Alexander's death, the emperor was replaced by Maximinus Thrax, a career soldier descended from a Dacian tribe called the Carpi. His short reign represented a stark departure from the Roman emperors of old. Thrax was a commoner. His father was an accountant who worked for the local government. By all accounts, he was nothing special, but he was the first emperor who wasn't from the aristocracy. He was also proclaimed emperor by his troops in Legio IV Italica and the Pannonian army. That in itself wasn't all that odd, but so-called barracks emperors who rose to power by virtue of their ability as commanders to hold the loyalty of their men would become an alarming trend throughout the 3rd century. The reason for this was simple and the natural progression from the old Marian and Augustan reforms to the army. Because it was the generals who paid their troops, many legionaries were more loyal to them than to the Roman state. What's more, for centuries the composition of the Roman military had been changing. It had been getting less Latin, relying more and more on men from the outer provinces, men who just a few centuries earlier had been considered barbarian savages. They had very different ideas about what it meant to be a Roman. For instance, they had little connection to the city of Rome itself, and saw the emperor as the embodiment of the empire. But back to Thrax for a moment. He tried to reinforce the borders and build up infrastructure, but there was only so much he could do in 4 years. Because of his hatred of the nobility and the fact that he neglected to visit Rome upon his ascension to the throne, the Senate revolted, and several emperors were proclaimed one after the other. Gordian, Gordian II, Pupienus Balbinus, and Gordian III were all proclaimed in 238. Maximinus Thrax went to Rome to put down the rebellion, but he failed when the city of Aquileia refused to let him in and he laid siege. The siege lasted entirely too long for his men, and he was killed by his own soldiers. Live by the sword, die by the sword, I suppose. Pupienus and Balbinus succeeded him as co-emperors, but both were killed by the Praetorians, and Gordian III was the last emperor standing. We already had a year of 5 emperors, but 238 was the year of 6 emperors, and the crisis was only just getting started. Gordian III may have technically been the emperor, but that didn't mean anything to the generals fighting one another for control of Rome. While they were busy fighting amongst themselves, several armies of Germanic barbarians poured across the Rhine border to raid the relatively wealthy border towns on the other side. Still more flooded over the Danube frontier and attacked Greece and Macedon, 2 of the wealthiest Roman provinces. Just when it seemed things couldn't get worse, a plague descended upon the empire in 251. The plague of Cyprian, as it's known today, was probably smallpox. But because of how disorganized things were in this period, it's difficult to judge the precise extent of the damage, but suffice it to say, the plague devastated an empire already torn apart by civil war and Germanic invasion. In Alexandria alone, 62% of the population either died or fled during the plague. But that wasn't the only natural disaster to destabilize Rome in the 3rd century. The world was changing in more ways than one. As the political environment of the 3rd century Mediterranean changed, so too did the actual environment. For whatever reason, the climate began to change in the 3rd century, which caused greater variability in temperature and drier summers. This crippled Rome's agricultural output, leading to widespread famine. They were being slaughtered by Germanic barbarians, they were dropping like flies from the plague, and now they were starving to death in the streets of once prosperous Roman towns and cities. As Rome struggled to maintain any sort of control over the empire, parallel authorities began to rise in the outer provinces. In 260, the provinces of Gaul, Britain, and later Hispania broke off and formed the Gallic Empire, over which several generals and warlords would lay claim to in the 14 years of its existence. 7 years later, Rome was at war with another new threat. The familiar enemy of Parthian Persia was replaced by a much more aggressive dynasty called the Sassanids. They were eager to destroy the Hellenized culture of Persia that had been imposed by the Greeks during the reign of Alexander and his successor kingdoms. The Sassanids wanted a return to the Persia of old, to the glory days of the Achaemenid Empire which once stretched from Greece to India. In 260, the Emperor Valerian went to the east to respond to an incursion from the Sassanids. They had broken through the Mesopotamian border and captured Armenia and Antioch. But Valerian was defeated by the Sassanids and captured. He was the first Roman emperor to be captured in battle, and to rub salt in that particular wound, he later died in captivity. Then, in 267, the eastern parts of the empire broke away, and Egypt, Palestine, Syria, and most of Anatolia became part of the Palmyrene Empire, which was ruled by Queen Zenobia as regent for her 10-year-old son, Vabalanthus. With an empire split into 3 parts, at war with Germanic barbarians on one end and a resurgent Persia on the other, it seemed like this was the end for the Romans. As the Roman elite fought for control of the various parts of the empire, there was a change sweeping through the lower rungs of Roman society. The army wasn't coming to help. Prayers to the gods went unanswered, and who the emperor was changed from month to month. It's no wonder the average Roman started looking for answers outside of those failed institutions. Roman religion saw the most profound changes in the 3rd century. As their world was thrown into chaos, the distant pagan gods concerned with running the universe seemed ever more distant and disconnected from the lives of regular people. Many began turning to new faiths. Greek mystery cults in particular saw a rise in popularity. The goddess Isis also spread far outside her homeland of Egypt, and worshippers of Osiris's sister wife could be found in Rome, Athens, and London. The cult of Mithras also became very popular, and even Judaism picked up a few converts outside of its place and people of origin. But most popular by far of these religions was Christianity. It outpaced the religion of Isis, the masculinity cult of Mithras, and even its parent religion in relatively short order. Since the death of its founder and central figure, a poor carpenter from Nazareth called Yeshua, the Christians had gained many converts among the poor and dispossessed in Roman society. Slaves, the downtrodden, women in particular, all liked what the new religion had to say about the universal value of the human soul, regardless of the body it dwelled within. Despite frequent persecution by the Roman state, these Christians had grown in number and formed communities centered upon their churches, which in those early days were more often than not little more than a room in somebody's house. But what we see happening in the 3rd century is Christianity making a jump from the poor and downtrodden to the middle class. Merchants, tradesmen, your good, honest working Titus and Marcus. As their lives were uprooted by the crisis of the 3rd century, as they were preyed upon by barbarians from Germania and Persia, as the economy tanked and as famine swept through the empire, many found solace in the religion of Jesus, the carpenter from Galilee. See, despite the persecutions, Christians weren't that uncommon. The persecutions were intermittent and usually happened when the state needed a scapegoat. But that wasn't happening all the time. And unlike many other cults and religions spreading in the 3rd century, Christians didn't split themselves off from Roman society. They didn't have the dietary or clothing restrictions of their precursor religion of Judaism, so they were completely indistinguishable from other Romans, aside from their absence in pagan temples and festivals. Many people in the empire knew a Christian, or perhaps several. They saw these Christian communities supporting one another and likely got a little curious. When they inevitably asked about the doctrine, they may have been surprised to learn just how easy it was to become a Christian, relatively speaking, of course. Christianity accepted converts of every ethnicity and culture and from every strata of society and from every occupation. It was the first universalist religion. Unlike the Hellenic, Celtic, or Germanic gods, Jesus wasn't bound to a particular ethnic group or region. Unlike the cult of Mithras, it didn't make one gender more divine than the other. In fact, Jesus' first followers, all ethnic Jews like him, were rejected by their former co-religionists and spread far and wide. Ever an intellectually curious people, many Greeks took to the religion, and Greek philosophy worked its way into infant Christianity. I often say Christianity may be a child of Semitic culture, but it was raised by Greeks. The universality of Christianity was its greatest strength in a place like Rome. While the Roman elite had spread across the empire and Romanization brought Latin culture to the whole of the Mediterranean basin, most towns and cities still kept their local identities and their local gods. More often than not, the Romans just added these gods to the pantheon or viewed them as different manifestations of their own gods. That was the point of the Pantheon in Rome, after all. It's a gorgeous building, but its original purpose was to be a temple to all gods. If you prayed to Tyr or Zeus or Isis or Lugh, they'd all hear it if you prayed in the Pantheon. But Christianity was able to transcend that. Jesus' message was meant for the whole world, not just the Jews or the Greeks or the Egyptians. It has always been able to adapt to new cultures and languages. As such, it spread across the whole world. It got very popular in Rome, but some Christians, like the Nestorians, struck out east, and they got as far as India and Mongolia. Indeed, when Genghis Khan first stormed out of the plains of Mongolia, he had Nestorian Christians among his generals and soldiers. Finally, another thing to consider is the role of the individual in Christianity. In Hellenic religion, most people were hapless schmucks, toys in the hands of a bunch of gods who amounted to incestuous, horny party animals. After all, most problems in Greek mythology and most solutions in Greek mythology can be chalked up to Zeus screwing somebody he really shouldn't have. But in Christianity, each and every human being, be they man or woman, slave or free, could have a personal connection with the one true God, the creator of all there is, all there was, and all there ever will be. It also offered women more of a role. In Roman religion, being a Vestal Virgin was about as prominent as it got. But in Christianity, women could go into the religious life as nuns or sisters. They could become missionaries and play an active part in spreading the religion. Then there was the afterlife. Suffice it to say, heaven sounds a lot more appealing than the fields of Asphodel. Eternity in paradise, in the presence of an all-loving, all-caring God, beats the hell out of these shadowy fields where most of us poor bastards end up, wailing and flitting about like shadows and dust. Elysium was reserved for heroes, but heaven was for anybody who wanted it. And keep in mind, when war, famine, and disease were lowering everyone's life expectancy, many looked to their inevitable deaths and dwelt on what, if anything, came after. I find it highly likely they would have been looking for some place comfortable to spend eternity, and spending it in the arms of an all-loving father sounded better than Hades. I will be coming back to Christianity several times in this series, but its spread and rise to prominence in Rome began as the chaos of the 3rd century drove Romans to look for answers elsewhere. And it was far from the only major change Rome underwent in the 3rd century. The entire structure of Roman civilization began to change from top to bottom. As Western Rome faced frequent Germanic raids across both the Rhine and Danube, small towns and villages were ransacked. The small landholders and family farms that had driven the Roman economy for centuries fled to the households of wealthier landholders with large swathes of property throughout the Roman countryside. They would end up working that landholder's fields in exchange for protection, and here we see the beginnings of what became feudalism. The Roman countryside concentrated into the hands of a few absurdly wealthy landholders, people who could afford to protect their land and the people working on it. Over time, this arrangement would become institutionalized and form the basis for the medieval society of the Germanic kingdoms that came after Rome in the West. The East avoided this feudalization largely, and that's mostly due to the sort of enemy they had to contend with. The Germanic barbarians were less armies and more raiding parties, looking to seize wealth wherever they could find it. Now, organized state armies were no strangers to rape or looting, but they were typically more targeted in their predation. The Persian army focused on large urban centers and fortified military outposts. They had no reason to indiscriminately ransack small towns or individual farmhouses, so the small landholders of the East had no reason to flee to the property of larger landholders. Further compounding this issue in the West was a change in how soldiers were compensated. Many of those small landholders were soldiers or the descendants of soldiers. They received their land as a final compensation for their 25 years of military service. In the 3rd century and beyond, the land became a less common compensation for a soldier, and more often than not, they received a lump sum of cash upon the completion of their service. The Eastern Empire would encounter this problem much later in history, but they would counter it through the theme system, where soldiers were given land upon retirement, but when they died, that land would transfer back to the state. The emperor owned all the land and gave it out to local lords and soldiers at his will. It was a different take on feudalism, a hybrid of the old and the new, and it was part of why Byzantium was the most prosperous state of the medieval period. They may have spoken Greek, but their Romanness was on full display in how adaptable they were. And, speaking of adapting, just as it seemed the Roman Empire would disintegrate in the face of Germanic attacks from one side, Persian invasion from the other, and civil war from within, a new emperor emerged and restored the world. His name was Aurelian, and he was unlike anything that had come before. Born either in Greece or Illyria, and possibly the son of a freed slave, Aurelian was a man of humble beginnings. By all accounts, much like Maximinus Thrax, he was nothing special. In 235, at the age of 20, he enlisted in the Roman army, and he quickly built up a reputation for competence in several engagements throughout the mid to late 3rd century. His abilities as a soldier got him far in an age of war and strife, so by 268 he had achieved the rank of commander of a cavalry unit in the personal entourage of Emperor Gallienus. While serving with him, Aurelian married Ulpia Severina. We don't know too much about her, or their marriage, other than that she was from Dacia, and that they had a daughter together. In keeping with the utter shitshow that was the 3rd century, Gallienus was replaced as emperor by a general called Claudius in 268. Aurelian was one of his supporters, and he continued to serve with distinction, soon becoming the commander of an elite unit called the Dalmatian Cavalry. Before being promoted to Magister Equitum, Aurelian continued kicking ass and taking names in that capacity. He hounded an incursion of Alemanni along the upper Danube border through the Alps until he met up with the forces of the emperor and scored a major victory at the Battle of Lake Benicus in northern Italy, defeating one of the many tribes that had been raising hell in the empire. But the general couldn't rest on his laurels. 4 tribes had broken through the border further east in the Balkans. The Herulii, Goths, Gepid, and Bastarnae were ransacking the region and needed to be dealt with. Aurelian was dispatched with his cavalry to interfere with the invaders until Claudius could arrive with the main body of the army, and Aurelian did just that. He harassed the Germans and forced them to stop their raiding in Macedonia. As they fled north, Aurelian hit them again, devastating the enemy with a cavalry ambush, killing as many as 3,000 men. When Claudius arrived, he led another ambush, breaking every tribe except the Goths who fled south, only to be doggedly pursued by Aurelian once again. Eventually the Roman army caught up with them in the Haemus Mountains, but the tribe survived yet again in a pitched battle and managed to escape. Claudius fell ill on the long campaign, but the army couldn't stop now. Aurelian was sent on to deal with the Goths. He did eventually manage to isolate and destroy them, but Claudius succumbed to his illness, and his brother Quintillus rose to power with the Senate's support. However, the army was going to be damned if they would recognize him. The men proclaimed Aurelian emperor in May 270, claiming that Claudius had chosen him as his successor on his deathbed. Aurelian quickly defeated Quintillus in battle and secured his throne. His first moves involved campaigning against the remaining barbarians in Roman territory. The Vandals, Juthungi, and Sarmatians were all still raiding in northern Italy. But within a year, those barbarians were dealt with, and Aurelian was given the epithet Germanicus Maximus. He also put down numerous usurpers and pretenders in that same year. Because, crisis of the 3rd century. That's why. But the crisis had shattered the illusion of safety within Italy, and especially within the capital. The walls of Rome had not been expanded for centuries because there was no need for it. But Aurelian commissioned a new set of walls around the city called, fittingly, the Aurelian Walls. They still stand today and protected the city from Germanic raids. They were no Theodosian walls, but they got the job done. Then there was the issue of Dacia. The province was Rome's only territory beyond the Danube and stretched Rome's already strained military resources even further. After launching a new campaign against the Goths in the region and killing their leader Canabaudes, Aurelian decided to abandon Dacia. All Roman forces were pulled out and the territory was left to its fate. This would become a trend moving forward. Dacia was the first province abandoned by the Romans in the name of defending the core of the empire, but it would not be the last. Dacia was an investment, a bad one. It cost the Romans far more than it had ever returned. Abandoning it to consolidate the empire's defenses along the Rhine and Danube was a smart move, especially considering the Germans were dealt with for now. The major tribes that had invaded Roman territory earlier in the crisis had been beaten back beyond the frontiers, and those frontiers now had no glaring weak spots. Aurelian had done more in the first year of his rule than most emperors of the crisis of the 3rd century had done in their whole reigns, at least the ones that had ruled for more than a year. He had dealt with Rome's problems with the ruthless efficiency of a career soldier. Aurelian didn't mess around, and it was him who would serve as the model of Roman emperors moving forward. He was rough around the edges. His family wasn't special, he had come from nothing, and now he had the power to remake the world. Diocletian, Constantine, Justin, and Justinian were all emperors in the mold of Aurelian. The old Roman aristocracy had failed. Now a new group of men would shape the empire. These were not men who had been molded into classical gentlemen by the tutors and high culture of the senatorial elite. Instead, they had been forged in the harsh realities of life in the outer provinces and the crucible of war. Aurelian was the dawn of the soldier emperors. But before he could do anything else, he had to deal with two very big problems. Let's focus on the good first. The army was behind Aurelian. He had no real rivals domestically, and the largest of the Germanic incursions had been dealt with. The bad. The Gallic and Palmyrene empires still held large swaths of Roman territory. Gaul, Britain, Hispania, Anatolia, Syria, Palestine, and Egypt were all vital regions that needed to be restored to Roman rule. The bigger of the two issues was the Palmyrene Empire and its troublesome queen regent Zenobia. The east was the wealthiest part of the empire by far. The vital trade cities of Antioch and Alexandria connected Rome with the Silk Road. There were also frontier towns like Damascus, Palmyra, and Nisibis, which protected the border with the Persians. Not to mention Zenobia held Egypt, the breadbasket of the Roman Empire. Rome needed Egypt's agricultural surplus to sustain its urban population centers. Rome, for example, with its million-plus inhabitants, had outgrown what central Italy's farmlands could actually support. So Aurelian's priorities were clear. Once the east was recaptured, regaining control over Gaul, Hispania, and Britain would be child's play, relatively speaking. In 272, Aurelian marched his armies east. He quickly and mercilessly cut a path through Palmyrene Anatolia. He destroyed every city that dare resist him except Tyana. Supposedly, Aurelian had a vision of a philosopher that he respected greatly in a dream, and in that dream that philosopher persuaded him to spare Tyana. But regardless of what inspired it, it was a good move. Many other cities surrendered willingly after seeing the mercy Aurelian had extended to Tyana. The emperor then captured Issus and crushed Zenobia's armies at the Battle of Amai. This forced the queen regent to retreat to Antioch. However, the city didn't offer her the protection she needed from Aurelian's unstoppable advance. So she fled again to Emesa, near modern-day Homs, Syria. There, Zenobia and her general Zabdas were caught and severely defeated once again by Aurelian's men at the Battle of Emesa, forcing the queen regent to flee to Palmyra. Aurelian's march through the desert was difficult. Bedouin tribes loyal to the queen harassed his legions, appearing from the sands and disappearing as quickly as they came, leaving dead Romans in their wake. Nothing would stop Germanicus Maximus, though. By summer 272, Aurelian had besieged Palmyra, and he attempted to get the queen to surrender. She refused, and the Romans made several attempts at capturing the city by storm, but they all met with failure. The siege wasn't going well for the city, though. Eventually, Zenobia attempted to flee to ask for help from Persia, but the Romans captured her. She and other high-ranking Palmyrenes were tried at Emesa and executed. Palmyra itself surrendered peacefully, and Aurelian tore down its defenses and left 600 men in the city to help keep the peace. It didn't help much, though. The loyalists to the Palmyrene Empire rebelled in 273 under Septimus Apsios, but that revolt was put down quickly and brutally by the emperor. Palmyra was razed to the ground. All of the city's temples were looted for resources to decorate Aurelian's new temple to Sol in the capital. Civilians were slaughtered, buildings were torn down, and the city was left a smoldering ruin. In an instant, the East was reminded why they were all part of the Roman Empire in the first place. However, despite his brutal sacking of Palmyra, Antioch was untouched. With the East restored to Roman rule, it was time to deal with the rebellious Gallic Empire in the West. Once, Caesar had marched a Roman army victoriously across all of Gaul. Now, Aurelian would return and bring the provinces of Gaul to heel once again. The Gallic emperors were preoccupied by Germanic invaders when Aurelian marched his army into the region in 274. The Gallic Empire was falling apart in the mid-270s, and in the Battle of Chalons, Aurelian defeated the last emperor, a man called Tetricus. But, unlike in the East, many administrators of the Gallic Empire, including Tetricus, fell in line and actually continued their careers under new management from Rome. After the drama in the East, Aurelian was probably pleasantly surprised by how easy it had been to kick the Western rebels back into line. In just 3 short years, Aurelian had driven back the encroaching barbarians and restored a divided empire. That might have been enough for most people, but Aurelian was not most people. He also instituted several reforms, like the elevation of the sun god Sol Invictus to the main deity of the Roman pantheon. He wanted one god to unite one empire in worship. He also adopted the title of god and born ruler, and he persecuted the Christians, rivals to his new take on Roman religion. The funny thing here is that Constantine and his successors would achieve Aurelian's one faith, one empire idea, albeit through the God of Abraham and Jesus Christ. The emperor also instituted more monetary reforms in an attempt to fix the Roman economy. The Antoniani was a new silver coin with 5% purity. 20 of them made up one of the old silver denarii. Despite his best efforts, though, the old coins still remained in circulation, and Rome's economy remained a hot mess. Finally, Aurelian reformed the grain distribution to the Roman poor. Instead of handing out raw grain, the state now distributed loaves of bread. He also managed to increase the size of the loaves without increasing their cost, pleasing both Roman taxpayers and welfare recipients alike. He also rebuilt the city of Cenabum in Gaul and renamed it Aurelianum, which, over time, became Orléans in modern-day France. Despite the fact that he had restored Rome's tarnished glory, Aurelian had many enemies, largely in the Senate. To say they disliked his autocratic style of rule and his provincial low-class sensibilities would be a colossal understatement. The emperor set out in 275 to capitalize on an opportunity to attack Persia, but he would never make it back east. Aurelian had a reputation for being strict and punishing poor and corrupt administrators severely. A secretary of the emperor, called Eros, had been told to lie about something minor, and, in fear of the emperor's retribution, he forged a document in Aurelian's hand, marking high-ranking officials in the Praetorian Guard for execution. When the Praetorians got a hold of that forgery, a man called Mucapor and other Praetorian commanders murdered Aurelian in September 275 at the Senofrorium in Thrace, modern-day European Turkey. For a time, it seemed as if the crisis of the 3rd century would begin anew, and for a decade it did. But in 284, another rough soldier from the Balkans with a will of iron would bring the crisis to an end for good. His name was Diocletian, born Diocles to a low-status Balkan family in modern-day Croatia. When the Emperor Numerian died while campaigning in Persia, his generals and tribunes called for a council to choose a successor. They picked Diocletian, and it was his reign that would bring about an end to the chaos of the 3rd century and mark the beginning of a new Roman Empire, one ready to face a brave new world. But that's a story for another time. Next, we'll be taking a look at the 3rd century from the other side, getting the perspective of the Germanic peoples and the Persians. Rome, after all, was not experiencing this chaos in a vacuum. But, until next time, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. I'm Renegade Historian. Have a wonderful day, everyone.